I'm 73 years old, and I'm dying of heart failure that the doctors say came from 41 years of living with guilt so profound it literally broke the organ that's supposed to sustain life. Before this disease takes what little time I have left, I need someone to know about Magnus, about the night of October 31st, 1983, when 3 men broke into my remote cabin intent on robbery and worse, and about how a being whose existence official science denied saved my life by appearing at my bedroom window like an avenging angel sent to protect someone who'd never believed in miracles. My name is Linda Patterson, and back then I was 32 years old, living alone in a cabin I'd inherited from my grandfather deep in the Oregon Cascade Mountains, 40 miles from the nearest neighbor and 60 miles from anything resembling civilization. I'd moved there after my divorce to escape a world that had made me feel like a failure, seeking the kind of solitude that might heal wounds that 2 years of marriage to an abusive alcoholic had carved into my ability to trust anyone or anything. What I never expected was that my sanctuary would become the site of the most terrifying night of my life. When 3 escaped convicts from Oregon State Penitentiary chose my isolated cabin for what they assumed would be easy robbery from a woman who had no neighbors to hear her screams and no law enforcement within hours of response time. Harold Jenkins, Robert Martinez, and Carl Thompson had been planning their escape for months, studying maps that showed remote properties where they could steal supplies, transportation, and whatever else they needed while avoiding the manhunt that would follow their disappearance from federal custody. The attack began at 11:47 p.m. on Halloween night, when I woke to sounds of someone forcing entry through my kitchen door. I'd been living alone for 6 months, long enough to develop the kind of hypervigilance that comes from understanding that help was too far away to matter if something went wrong. And the sounds of splintering wood triggered every survival instinct I'd developed during my marriage to a man who'd taught me that violence could come without warning and escalate beyond anything rational people could imagine. Please, God, let them just take whatever they want and leave, I whispered while grabbing the .38 revolver I kept in my nightstand, knowing that 3 men intent on more than simple theft would probably overpower me regardless of whatever resistance I could offer with limited ammunition and no experience in actual combat situations. But Harold Jenkins wasn't interested in quick robbery. The police reports I'd read years later would reveal that he'd committed multiple sexual assaults during previous escapes, and that his pattern involved prolonged torture of isolated women who couldn't escape or summon help. The other 2 men were following his lead, and their conversation as they moved through my cabin made clear that stealing my belongings was only the beginning of what they planned to do during their time at my property. 3 men, 1 woman, and nobody around for miles to interfere with our plans, Jenkins called toward my bedroom, his voice carrying the sadistic pleasure of someone who'd spent months anticipating this moment. We've got all night to get acquainted, lady, and then we'll decide whether you're worth keeping alive or whether it's safer to eliminate witnesses who might identify us to the authorities. I'd locked my bedroom door and positioned furniture against it, but the barriers that might slow determined intruders for a few minutes wouldn't prevent what was coming. Through my window, I could see only darkness that offered no escape route from a second-story room that overlooked terrain too rough for safe jumping, even if desperation made the attempt seem worthwhile. That's when Magnus appeared at my bedroom window, his massive face pressed against glass that separated us by inches, his eyes holding depths of intelligence and protective fury that made clear he understood exactly what was happening inside my cabin and had chosen to intervene despite enormous personal risk. He was enormous, easily 9 feet tall, covered in dark brown fur that made him nearly invisible against the forest night, with features that combined human intelligence with adaptations for wilderness survival that belonged in evolution textbooks rather than rescue operations. For maybe 10 seconds, we stared at each other through glass that had become a barrier between species that weren't supposed to be able to communicate or cooperate in emergency situations. Then Magnus gestured toward the window latch with movements that were unmistakably urgent, indicating that I should open the barrier between us so he could provide assistance that no human agency could deliver in time to prevent the violence that was approaching my bedroom with methodical inevitability. The heart failure that's killing me started beating irregularly the day I understood what happened to Magnus after he saved my life. After his intervention triggered federal investigations that treated his protective behavior as a national security threat, requiring systematic hunting and elimination. For 41 years, I've lived knowing that somewhere in underground research facilities, the soul who risked everything to protect me has spent most of his remaining life as a test subject for people who will never understand that they're torturing someone who demonstrated the kind of heroism that most humans never find the courage to attempt. The moment I opened my bedroom window to let Magnus inside, our interaction transcended every boundary that science claimed existed between human and non-human intelligence, as this magnificent being moved through the opening with remarkable grace despite his enormous size, and immediately positioned himself between me and the bedroom door where Harold Jenkins was systematically breaking through barriers I'd constructed to delay the inevitable. Magnus stood nearly 9 feet tall in my small bedroom, his presence simultaneously the most terrifying and most comforting sight I'd ever experienced. His face combined human intelligence with features adapted for wilderness survival: broader nose, more pronounced jaw structure, brow ridge that suggested evolutionary paths divergent from our own species. But his eyes held depths of consciousness and moral reasoning that were unmistakably familiar to anyone who'd ever recognized nobility and courage in another being. "Stay behind me," Magnus said in English that was accented but perfectly clear, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone who'd faced dangerous situations before and understood exactly what needed to be done to ensure the safety of innocent people. "These men mean to hurt you, and I won't allow that to happen while I have strength to prevent it." The intelligence in his voice, combined with his obvious understanding of the crisis unfolding in my cabin, shattered every assumption I'd held about what kinds of beings possessed consciousness and moral reasoning. This wasn't a wild animal responding to territorial threats. This was someone who'd made conscious decisions about protecting victims from predators, someone whose value system included obligations to defend the innocent, regardless of the personal risks such intervention might create. "How do you know English?" I whispered, while Jenkins continued breaking through my bedroom door, his cursing and threats growing louder as he encountered resistance he hadn't expected from someone he'd assumed would be helpless against 3 determined attackers. "My people have been watching yours for generations," Magnus replied, while examining my bedroom window to ensure we had escape routes if the situation deteriorated beyond what direct confrontation could resolve. "We understand your language, your behavior patterns, and your capacity for both good and evil. Tonight, evil has come to your home, and good demands that someone with the power to help must choose to intervene." The philosophical framework Magnus described revealed sophisticated understanding of moral obligations and social responsibility that challenged everything I thought I knew about consciousness and ethical reasoning. Here was someone who'd developed complex theories about justice, protection, and individual responsibility for community welfare, concepts that many humans never mastered despite advantages of formal education and cultural instruction. Jenkins finally broke through my bedroom door at 12:23 a.m., entering with the confident swagger of someone who'd anticipated easy victory over isolated prey. His expression changed immediately when he saw Magnus standing protectively in front of me, this massive being whose very existence challenged everything Jenkins thought he knew about North American wildlife and wilderness survival. "What the hell is that thing?" Jenkins shouted while backing toward the doorway, his bravado immediately replaced by terror at encountering something that belonged in folklore rather than criminal scenarios he'd planned during months of preparation for escape and robbery. Magnus's response was both measured and unmistakably threatening, delivered in the calm voice of someone who possessed both physical power and moral authority to enforce protection of innocent victims. "I am someone who prevents men like you from harming women who cannot defend themselves against superior numbers and criminal violence. You have choices to make about whether you leave peacefully or whether I demonstrate what happens to predators who refuse reasonable requests to abandon their prey." The standoff that followed lasted maybe 2 minutes, during which Jenkins tried to assess whether the massive being confronting him represented genuine threat or elaborate hoax designed to frighten away intruders. Martinez and Thompson had joined him in my bedroom doorway, but all three men understood that whatever they were seeing challenged their assumptions about what kinds of resistance they might encounter in remote wilderness areas. "This is some kind of trick," Martinez declared while examining Magnus for signs of costume or mechanical augmentation that might explain how someone had created such an elaborate deception. "Nobody lives in these mountains except that woman, and there's no way she could have arranged this kind of backup without us knowing about it." But Thompson, who'd grown up hearing stories about cryptid encounters in Pacific Northwest forests, immediately understood that they were confronting something that existed far outside their criminal expertise or ability to manage through conventional violence. "That's not a person in a costume," he said, while slowly backing away from my bedroom. "That's a real Bigfoot, and we need to get out of here before it decides to protect that woman by killing us." Magnus advanced toward the three men with movements that demonstrated both overwhelming physical capability and remarkable restraint, giving them opportunities to choose retreat over confrontation while making clear that continued aggression would result in consequences they were unprepared to handle. "Leave now, and you will not be harmed," Magnus announced with finality that suggested this was their last chance to avoid violence that would demonstrate exactly why his people had survived centuries of human encroachment through superior strength and intelligence. "Remain, and you will learn why women in these mountains have always been safer than your kind assumes." The three escaped convicts fled my cabin with the panicked desperation of men who'd suddenly understood they were facing something far beyond their criminal experience or ability to overcome through violence and intimidation. Magnus watched from my bedroom window as their stolen vehicle disappeared down the mountain road, his posture alert and protective until he was certain they wouldn't return with reinforcements or weapons that might pose continuing threats to my safety. "They won't come back," Magnus said while examining the damage they'd inflicted on my cabin during their attempted break-in. "Men like that are cowards who prey on isolated victims because they lack courage to face opponents capable of defending themselves. Tonight they learned that even remote mountains contain protectors they never suspected existed." The calm authority in Magnus's voice, combined with his obvious knowledge about criminal psychology and predator behavior, revealed intelligence and cultural wisdom that challenged everything I thought I knew about consciousness and social organization. He wasn't simply a powerful being who'd happened to intervene in my crisis. He was someone who'd spent years studying human behavior and developing sophisticated understanding of justice, protection, and moral obligations that extended beyond tribal or species boundaries. "Thank you," I said, the words completely inadequate for expressing gratitude towards someone who'd risked his own safety to protect me from attackers who'd certainly intended rape and probably murder after they'd finished with whatever they'd planned for the remainder of Halloween night. "I don't know how you knew I was in trouble or why you chose to help me, but you saved my life tonight." Magnus's response revealed both remarkable humility and the kind of philosophical depth that suggested extensive contemplation about relationships between different forms of consciousness. Protecting innocence from predators isn't a choice. It's an obligation that comes with having power to help and wisdom to recognize when help is needed. My people have been watching over these mountains for centuries, ensuring that evil doesn't triumph simply because good lacks the strength or courage to intervene. The following hours became the most extraordinary conversation of my life, as Magnus shared knowledge about his people's culture, their relationship with human civilization, and their long history of providing protection to isolated families who'd found themselves threatened by dangers that conventional law enforcement couldn't prevent or resolve. His English was remarkably sophisticated, revealing generations of careful study of human language, literature, and social structures. "We are the guardians your ancestors knew existed, but your modern civilization has chosen to forget," Magnus explained while helping me repair the damage that Jenkins and his companions had inflicted on my cabin's security systems. When humans lived closer to natural systems, they understood that intelligence and consciousness existed in many forms, and they respected, rather than feared, beings who offered protection and wisdom. Magnus possessed practical skills that surpassed anything available through human wilderness education. He repaired my broken door with techniques that combined traditional carpentry with innovations that improved security, while maintaining aesthetic harmony with the cabin's original construction. More importantly, he installed early warning systems that would alert me to future intrusions while providing escape routes that could ensure my safety, even if attackers returned with better planning and superior numbers. "You live alone in dangerous isolation," Magnus observed, while creating defensive modifications that transformed my vulnerable cabin into a sanctuary that could protect a single woman from multiple threats. Human society fails to provide adequate security for individuals who choose independence over the false safety of urban crowding, and that failure creates opportunities for predators who understand that isolated prey receives no assistance when violence occurs. But beyond practical protection, Magnus provided emotional support that helped me process trauma from both the attack and the miraculous rescue that had prevented outcome too terrible to contemplate. He listened without judgment while I described my marriage to a violent alcoholic, my decision to seek wilderness isolation, and my growing understanding that living alone required skills and knowledge that suburban existence had never taught me to develop. Healing from human cruelty requires time and safe spaces where wounded souls can rediscover their strength, Magnus said, while preparing medicinal tea from plants he'd gathered during his journey to my cabin. Mountains provide that healing, but only when protectors ensure that peace isn't shattered by those who see isolation as opportunity for exploitation. Magnus remained with me through the remainder of Halloween night and into the following day, ensuring that the escaped convicts hadn't regrouped for another attempt while teaching me wilderness survival techniques that would improve my ability to live safely in such remote territory. His knowledge encompassed everything from food preservation to weather prediction to animal behavior patterns that could provide early warnings about dangerous situations. "My people could teach your people much about living in harmony with natural systems," Magnus reflected during conversations that revealed his deep sadness about the barriers that prevented cooperation between species that shared common values about protection, justice, and community welfare. But humans fear what they don't understand, and understanding requires humility that technological societies rarely develop. By November 1st, Magnus had transformed my cabin into a secure sanctuary while providing education that would sustain me through years of safe wilderness living. More importantly, he'd become the friend whose wisdom and protection made my isolation feel like chosen independence rather than dangerous exile from human community. But our growing friendship would ultimately destroy him when my gratitude overcame the discretion that had protected his people from human discovery for countless generations. Living with the knowledge of Magnus's existence and his protective presence in the Cascade Mountains created a psychological burden I'd never anticipated when he saved my life from 3 escaped convicts who would certainly have murdered me after completing their other plans. By spring of 1984, I found myself struggling with isolation that felt different from the solitude I'd originally sought. Not the healing quiet of wilderness independence, but the suffocating secrecy of protecting information that could destroy the being who'd shown me unprecedented kindness and courage. Magnus visited my cabin regularly throughout the winter months, bringing food during snowstorms that isolated me for weeks, providing medical care when illnesses challenged my limited supplies and knowledge, and most importantly, offering companionship that transformed my mountain exile from lonely survival into something approaching friendship with the most extraordinary individual I'd ever encountered. His wisdom about living in harmony with natural systems helped me develop skills that made wilderness life sustainable rather than merely endurable. "Your people seek happiness through possessions and social status," Magnus observed during one of our evening conversations beside the wood stove that had become our meeting place for discussions about consciousness, culture, and the vast differences between human and cryptid approaches to meaningful existence. My people find contentment through understanding our place in systems larger than individual desires and through fulfilling obligations to protect rather than exploit those systems. But the most challenging aspect of our friendship was Magnus's growing trust in my discretion and moral reasoning, demonstrated through revelations about his people's culture that made clear I was receiving information that could guide government agencies to communities that had survived centuries of human expansion through absolute secrecy. Magnus showed me maps of territorial boundaries, explained seasonal migration patterns, and described social structures that revealed sophisticated civilization existing parallel to human society without detection or interference. "We are not the primitive creatures your scientists imagine," Magnus explained, while sharing knowledge about cryptid technology, medicine, and spiritual practices that surpassed human achievements in sustainability and community welfare. "We choose simpler lifestyles, not from lack of intelligence, but from wisdom about what kinds of development create harmony rather than destruction in natural systems." The burden of protecting Magnus's secrets became overwhelming during my monthly trips to town for supplies that I couldn't produce through wilderness living. Each interaction with human civilization reminded me that I possessed information which could revolutionize scientific understanding of consciousness and intelligence, while simultaneously understanding that sharing such knowledge would lead to systematic hunting of beings whose only crime was existing in forms that challenged institutional understanding of North American wildlife. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, my former college roommate who'd become a wildlife biologist, noticed changes in my behavior during our occasional phone conversations that I'd maintained to preserve some connection to human community. My knowledge about forest ecology had expanded beyond anything conventional education could provide, and my confidence about wilderness survival suggested access to expertise that didn't exist in any academic or government resource. "Linda, you've learned things about forest systems that I've never encountered in professional literature," Sarah observed during a conversation that should have triggered every security alarm Magnus had taught me to recognize. "Your understanding of animal behavior and ecosystem management surpasses anything available through university programs. Where are you getting this information?" My response revealed the dangerous naivety that would ultimately destroy the being who trusted me with his people's survival. Instead of deflecting Sarah's curiosity with carefully prepared explanations that might satisfy her professional interest while protecting Magnus's identity, I began sharing observations and knowledge that could only have come from direct instruction by someone with generations of accumulated wisdom about cryptid ecology and behavior. "I've been learning from someone who understands these mountains better than any human scientist," I told Sarah with the pride of someone eager to demonstrate that wilderness living had provided advantages that urban civilization couldn't match. "There are forms of intelligence in these forests that academics have never imagined, and traditional knowledge that makes modern environmental science seem primitive by comparison." Sarah's professional curiosity was immediately aroused by hints that I was describing contact with undocumented species or previously unknown human populations that had developed advanced ecological knowledge through centuries of forest living. As a wildlife biologist working with federal agencies on endangered species research, she was required to report any information about unusual animal populations or uncontacted indigenous communities that might require governmental protection or study. "Linda, if you've discovered evidence of unknown species or isolated human communities, that information needs to be shared with appropriate scientific authorities," Sarah explained with the institutional loyalty that made sharing sensitive information with her far more dangerous than I'd understood. "The Department of Interior has protocols for protecting newly discovered populations while ensuring that scientific knowledge advances through proper documentation and study." But Sarah's concept of protection and study involved exactly the governmental intervention that Magnus had spent his entire life avoiding. And my growing friendship with her represented a breach of security that threatened not just Magnus, but his entire community with discovery and capture by agencies that saw cryptid intelligence as national resources requiring federal management. The betrayal happened gradually, through conversations that revealed progressively more details about Magnus's knowledge and protective behavior, until Sarah possessed enough information to convince her supervisors that federal investigation was warranted to document what appeared to be significant discoveries about previously unknown hominid populations in Pacific Northwest wilderness areas. March 18, 1985, was the day my friendship with Dr. Sarah Mitchell led federal agents to the cave system, where Magnus had been providing sanctuary for his extended family while continuing to protect isolated humans throughout the Cascade Mountains from dangers that conventional law enforcement couldn't prevent or resolve. The operation was coordinated through intelligence that combined my innocent revelations about cryptid knowledge with satellite surveillance that had been systematically mapping thermal signatures indicating large mammal populations in areas where official science claimed no such beings existed. We've located the primary target and what appears to be an entire community of unidentified hominid entities, Agent Harrison reported during operational briefings that would never appear in congressional oversight or public records. Subject demonstrates advanced intelligence and protective behavior patterns that represent both strategic opportunity and potential security threats requiring immediate federal containment. The assault began at dawn, coordinated by teams that had been positioned around Magnus's territorial boundaries for weeks, while satellite surveillance confirmed behavioral patterns and family structures. Tranquilizer weapons designed for subduing large, intelligent mammals were deployed simultaneously against beings who offered no violence beyond desperate attempts to protect their children from capture by people who saw them as valuable research specimens rather than conscious individuals deserving of respect and autonomy. Magnus was partially conscious when they loaded him into the containment vehicle, and his eyes found mine across the chaos of the operation with recognition that made clear he understood exactly who was responsible for the destruction of everything he'd spent centuries building in these mountains. The being who'd saved my life from 3 violent criminals was looking at the woman who'd repaid his protection with betrayal that would condemn him and his entire family to lifetime imprisonment in research facilities designed for studying consciousness and intelligence that existed in forms federal agencies had never been prepared to acknowledge. "Linda," Magnus called as tranquilizer drugs began taking effect, his voice carrying both forgiveness and profound sadness for someone whose trust had been systematically violated by institutional forces that valued discovery over the welfare of beings whose only crime was choosing to help rather than hiding from human contact. "Remember that protection and love exist in forms your people have forgotten how to recognize. Remember that some bonds transcend the boundaries others claim divide different kinds of consciousness." Agent Harrison's debriefing revealed the scope of the operation that my innocent friendship with Sarah Mitchell had enabled through revealing information about cryptid capabilities and territorial ranges that federal agencies had been seeking for decades. Magnus's capture provided opportunities for studying intelligence, consciousness, and potential military applications of non-human cognitive abilities that bureaucrats had been fantasizing about since the first credible cryptid reports crossed their desks. The subject demonstrates sophisticated understanding of human behavior, advanced problem-solving capabilities, and social organization that could provide strategic advantages if successfully analyzed and potentially replicated through technological development. Harrison explained, while Magnus disappeared into transport systems designed for valuable biological assets requiring maximum security classification. Sarah Mitchell received professional commendation for her role in locating what federal agencies described as the most significant cryptid capture in North American history. While I learned that my months of sharing knowledge about Magnus's wisdom had provided exactly the intelligence that hunting teams needed to systematically eliminate protective presence that had kept these mountains safe for countless generations. "You've made an extraordinary contribution to scientific understanding of consciousness and intelligence," Sarah told me during follow-up interviews designed to extract additional information about cryptid behavior and territorial patterns. "The knowledge you've provided will advance research that could revolutionize our understanding of evolution, cognitive development, and the potential for communication between human and non-human intelligence." But Sarah's enthusiasm for scientific advancement was built on complete ignorance about what federal agencies actually planned to do with beings whose consciousness and culture they'd spent decades hunting and suppressing. Magnus and his family weren't destined for respectful study that might lead to peaceful coexistence. They were heading for underground laboratories where they would spend whatever remained of their lives as test subjects for research designed to unlock biological secrets that might provide military advantages. The heart failure that's killing me started beating irregularly the day I understood that my trust in human goodness had condemned the most compassionate being I'd ever encountered to systematic torture by people who would never comprehend that they were studying someone whose moral wisdom surpassed anything their institutions could imagine. For 41 years, I've lived with knowledge about what my friendship cost Magnus, about the family that was destroyed because I couldn't keep secrets that ensured their survival. Magnus is 68 years old now, assuming he's survived 4 decades of research designed to unlock whatever biological mysteries his people might reveal about consciousness, intelligence, and potential strategic applications that federal agencies continue fantasizing about developing. Somewhere in facilities that don't appear on any public records, the being who risked everything to save my life has spent most of his remaining years as a laboratory subject being studied by people who will never understand that they're torturing someone who demonstrated heroism that most humans never find courage to attempt. The mountains where Magnus once protected isolated families from predators like the escaped convicts who would have murdered me are quieter now, emptied of the protective presence that made wilderness living safer than official statistics suggested. Children who become lost in Cascade Wilderness after 1985 began dying from exposure and predation at rates that previous generations had never experienced, because beings like Magnus had been systematically eliminated from territories where their intervention had prevented tragedies that human search efforts couldn't match.